care name, survived. Almost nothing is did. Celestine is not remembered because she left the testimony. She is remembered because someone wrote her name down while recording her punishment. That is the first truth that defines her story. Celestine does not enter history speaking. She enters history being acted upon, described by others, measured by others, judged by others. Everything we know about her exists because the system that owned her needed to document what it did to her. And even then, it recorded only what mattered to power. Her name appears in plantation and court records in the 19th century American South, not as a biography, not as a life, but as a case, a problem, a body subjected to discipline. This is where many stories of enslaved women begin and end. But Celestine's story refuses to stay that small because the very fact that her name survived when millions did not tells us something important. What happened to her disturbed the system enough that it had to be written down. And when power documents its own violence, it leaves behind traces it never intended to be read with sympathy. Celestine lived in a world where the law did not protect her. It managed her. She was owned. That ownership was legal, transferable, and enforceable. It gave others absolute authority over her labor, her movement, her body, and her punishment. Celestine's existence mattered only insofar as it served someone else's control. And yet, something happened, something that triggered records, something that demanded formal response, something that forced enslavers and courts to notice her. That something is not always described clearly in surviving documents. What is clear is that Celestine was punished severely publicly, formally, and with justification carefully recorded. The system wanted to be seen as orderly, rational, and lawful, even while inflicting extreme violence. This is the paradox at the heart of her story. Celestine was erased as a person, but preserved as a punishment. Her interior life, her thoughts, her fears, her reasoning was never considered relevant, but her body, once disciplined, became evidence. Proof that authority had been exercised correctly. Proof that control had been restored. This documentary is not about filling in the gaps with imagination. It is about reading the gaps themselves as evidence. When history refuses to tell us who Celestine was, we must ask why. When it records how she was punished but not why she acted, we must ask what kind of society creates records like that. When it preserves the mechanics of discipline but erases the human being at the center of it, we must understand that erasure as intentional. Celestine lived under a system that did not care whether she was innocent, desperate, intelligent, or terrified. It cared whether she was controlled, and at some point, the system decided that control had been challenged. That challenge, whatever form it took, was enough to trigger violence that needed explanation, enough to justify itself in writing, enough to leave behind a paper trail that centuries later still pulses with power and cruelty. Celestine's story is not loud. It is not dramatic in the way popular history prefers. It is quiet, procedural, and devastating. Because it shows how easily human suffering can be folded into routine, how pain can be justified through paperwork, how a life can be reduced to an example. And once you understand that, you begin to see Celestine everywhere. In the unnamed women punished before her, in the unnamed women punished after her, and the countless lives that never even received a name on paper. Celestine is not remembered because she was unique. She is remembered because she was typical enough for the system to discipline her without shame, and exceptional enough that the discipline was recorded. That tension is where her story begins, and once it begins, it does not let go. The ACT that turned a woman into a case. Whatever Celestine did or was accused of doing was serious enough to demand explanation, but not serious enough to require understanding her. That distinction mattered. In slavery, intent was irrelevant when authority felt threatened. What mattered was restoring control and proving that control publicly. The surviving records do not give us Celestine's voice. They do not quote her. They do not describe her reasoning. Instead, they describe the response. That alone tells us how the system worked. When enslaved people acted in ways that disrupted order by refusing, resisting, running, speaking, or simply enduring too visibly, the system did not ask why. It asked how to punish. Celestine's act has been summarized, filtered, and reduced by the people who owned her or judged her. It may have been labeled as disobedience. It may have been framed as insolence, theft, flight, or refusal. The specific label matters less than the pattern. Enslaved women were often punished not for crimes as such, but for violating expectations of submission. This is where gender enters decisively. Enslaved men were often punished for physical resistance or escape. Enslaved women were punished for behavior that challenged social control, talking back, refusing sexual access, leaving assigned spaces, asserting autonomy in small but visible ways. The system read these acts not as survival strategies, but as threats to hierarchy. Celestine's punishment was not spontaneous. It was procedural. Someone reported her. Someone documented her. Someone authorized violence against her. This chain matters. It shows that what happened to her was not an emotional outburst or an exception. It was a process that required agreement among those in power. That agreement transformed the human being into an object lesson. Records often describe such punishments in detached language. Words like corrected, disciplined, or made an example of appear frequently. These terms mask the reality of physical suffering behind administrative calm. Celestine's pain was not the point. Compliance was. And yet, the system felt the need to justify itself. That is why Celestine appears in records at all. Her punishment was severe enough that it required explanation, not to her but to other authorities. This suggests anxiety. A system confident in its righteousness does not explain itself. A system that documents its violence carefully is one that anticipates scrutiny. Celestine's body became the site where that anxiety was resolved. Punishment restored order not only by inflicting pain, but by demonstrating that the law stood firmly with ownership. Courts, overseers, and enslavers worked together to ensure that the outcome affirmed hierarchy. Whatever Celestine had done, the response needed to make clear that resistance of any scale would be answered decisively. What is striking is how little space the records give to Celestine herself. No questions about her circumstances, no acknowledgement of provocation, no curiosity about necessity or desperation. Her humanity was irrelevant to the outcome. This is how erasure works most effectively, not by denying that someone exists, but by denying that their interior life matters. Celestine was present in the record only as a problem to be solved, not as a person to be heard. And that is why her story demands attention, because when a system feels compelled to record punishment but not the person punished, it reveals its priorities with brutal clarity. Control mattered. Order mattered. Reputation mattered. Celestine did not. Yet paradoxically, this indifference preserved her name. She survives because the system needed to justify itself, and that justification, cold, procedural, and incomplete, becomes the doorway through which we can see how power actually functioned. Celestine's act did not need to be extraordinary to provoke violence. It only needed to be enough. Enough to unsettle. Enough to resist quietly. Enough to remind those in power that domination required constant reinforcement. And once that reinforcement began, it did not stop at correction. It moved toward example, how pain was turned into authority. When punishment was finally delivered to Celestine, it was not improvised. It followed a logic that had been refined over generations, a logic that understood violence not as chaos, but as communication. Slavery depended on clarity. It needed everyone watching to understand exactly who held power, how that power would be enforced, and what would happen if anyone tested it. Punishment was therefore designed to be visible, memorable, and instructive. Celestine's body became the medium through which that lesson was delivered. This is why enslaved women were often punished publicly. Public punishment did not just discipline the person targeted, it disciplined the entire community. Every scream, every mark left on the body, every forced witness reinforced the same message. Authority was absolute, and resistance, however small, would be answered with overwhelming force. The records that survive rarely describe pain in detail. They don't need to. Everyone involved already knew what whipping, confinement, or physical restraint meant. The absence of graphic description is itself telling. Violence was so normalized that it did not require elaboration. Celestine was not punished to correct her behavior alone. She was punished to restore confidence. The confidence of enslavers, overseers, and courts that control had not slipped. The system could not afford ambiguity. Any act that hinted at autonomy, refusal, or unpredictability had to be answered decisively. For enslaved women, punishment carried additional layers of meaning. Their bodies were already sites of control through labor, reproduction, and sexual vulnerability. Punishment reinforced that control by making it unmistakably physical. It reminded everyone that ownership extended not only to work, but to flesh itself. This is where punishment crossed into theater. The goal was not just pain, but memory. A punishment that was seen, heard, and remembered would outlast the moment itself. It would circulate in whispers, glances, and silences long after the event. Celestine's suffering became a warning without needing repetition. And yet, the system was careful to frame this violence as lawful. That framing mattered. Courts and plantation authorities presented punishment as reasonable, necessary, and proportionate, even when it was extreme. This allowed violence to masquerade as order. It allowed cruelty to be described as discipline. Celestine's punishment did not signal loss of control. It signaled its reassertion. But there is a contradiction here, one the records cannot hide. If authority were truly uncontested, punishment would not need to be so thorough, so public, so carefully justified. The intensity of the response suggests that something about Celestine's act unsettled the system more deeply than it wanted to admit. Perhaps it was her refusal to submit quietly. Perhaps it was her persistence. Perhaps it was her visibility. We may never know exactly what frightened those in power. What we do know is that fear traveled downward, and violence followed it. Celestine endured punishment not because she was powerless, but because she had demonstrated, however briefly, that power could be tested. The system responded by reminding everyone that such testing would not be tolerated. And yet, even in this moment of extreme domination, something escaped control. Celestine's pain had to be recorded. Someone had to write her name. Someone had to justify what was done. Someone had to explain why such force was necessary. Those justifications, preserved on paper, revealed the fragility beneath the authority. They show a system that could not simply punish and move on. It needed to explain itself, to reassure itself that violence was justified. That need is the crack where history enters. Celestine did not leave a testimony, but the system's explanation of her punishment tells us more than it intended. It shows how power relied on pain, how law shielded cruelty, and how enslaved women's bodies were used to stabilize an order that never felt secure. Her suffering was meant to end resistance. Instead, it preserved truth. Where the law stepped in, the product power, not people. When Celestine entered the legal record, she did not enter it as a person with rights. She entered it as a problem to be managed. Courts did not ask what had been done to her. They asked whether the response to her behavior had been sufficient, appropriate, and most importantly, lawful. This distinction is critical. The law was not neutral ground. It was an extension of ownership. Enslaved people could be discussed in legal settings, but not heard in them. Celestine's presence in court records did not indicate concern for her welfare. It indicated concern for order, precedent, and authority. The legal question was never, was Celestine wrong? It was discipline applied correctly? That framing allowed extreme violence to be processed calmly, even bureaucratically. Paperwork replaced empathy. Procedure replaced inquiry. Celestine's pain was filtered through language designed to make it appear necessary and restrained, even when it was anything but. Courts often describe punishment using technical terms. They focused on who authorized it, how it was carried out, and whether it aligned with existing statutes. This created the illusion of fairness while ensuring that the outcome never threatened the institution of slavery itself. Legality mattered more than justice. If punishment followed the correct process, it was considered valid regardless of its severity. This allowed courts to distance themselves from the physical reality of what they endorsed. They did not whip Celestine. They did not restrain her. They simply affirmed that it had been done properly. This separation was intentional. It allowed law to function as a shield for violence rather than a check on it. By focusing on procedure, courts avoided confronting the morality of what they sanctioned. Celestine's body bore the consequences of that avoidance. The records rarely linger on her condition afterward. There is little concern for injury, trauma, or long-term harm. Once the legal question was resolved, Celestine faded back into the background. The system had completed its task. Control had been reaffirmed. There was nothing more to discuss. This is another form of erasure. Celestine mattered enough to punish, but not enough to follow up. Her suffering was relevant only at the moment it served authority. After that, she was expected to resume her role as labor, as property, as silence. The law's involvement gave the punishment legitimacy. That legitimacy was crucial. It reassured enslavers that they were protected. It warned enslaved people that resistance would not find refuge in courts, and it signaled to the wider society that violence, when done in the name of order, was acceptable. Celestine's case shows how deeply intertwined law and domination were. The courtroom did not stand apart from the plantation. It reinforced it. It provided language, structure, and justification for actions that would otherwise appear indefensible. By translating pain into paperwork, the law made cruelty administrable. And yet, those records survive. They survive because law prides itself on documentation. In trying to legitimize violence, it left behind evidence of its priorities. Evidence that tells us whose interests mattered, whose voices were excluded, and how easily justice was replaced with order. Celestine's presence in legal archives is therefore double-edged. It marks her subjugation, but it also exposes the system that subjugated her. Her case reveals that slavery was not lawless brutality. It was organized, sanctioned, and protected by institutions that claimed to uphold fairness. That revelation is uncomfortable because it means cruelty did not happen despite the law. It happened through it. How fear sprayed after her, even when she disappeared after the punishment was delivered and the paperwork filed. Celestine did not become a subject of discussion. She became a reference. This is how fear works in systems of domination. It does not need repetition. It needs memory. Other enslaved women did not need to know exactly what Celestine had done. They did not need to read court records or hear legal justifications. All they needed to know was what happened to her, and that knowledge traveled quickly, quietly, and efficiently. Fear did not move through official channels. It moved through glances, through silences, through altered behavior. Women learned what was expected by watching what happened when expectations were violated. Celestine's punishment did not end with her body. It extended outward, shaping choices, suppressing speech, and narrowing the range of what felt possible. This is why enslaved women's resistance often appears fragmented or muted in historical records. It was not absent. It was constrained. Celestine's experience taught others that certain lines, once crossed, would not simply be punished. They would be documented, formalized, and used as precedent. The involvement of courts made this lesson even more chilling. It meant there was no external authority to appeal to, no higher standard of fairness to invoke. The law had already chosen a side. For enslaved women, this knowledge carried particular weight. Their lives were already subject to intense scrutiny by owners, overseers, and other women within plantation households. They were expected to manage labor, domestic tasks, and vulnerability simultaneously. Any deviation from expected behavior risked punishment that could be framed as correction rather than cruelty. Celestine's case clarified that risk. It showed that punishment could escalate quickly, that it could leave permanent marks, and that it could be justified afterward as necessary. This discouraged not only overt resistance, but also subtle forms of self-assertion. Silence became safer than speech. Compliance safer than explanation. Invisibility safer than excellence. The system did not need to punish everyone. It needed to punish someone visibly enough that everyone else adjusted. Celestine became that someone. And then she disappeared again. The records do not tell us how she lived afterward. They do not track her recovery, her health, her state of mind. She was expected to return to her role as labor, her suffering absorbed into routine. This disappearance reinforces the lesson her punishment taught. The system did not care about aftermath. It cared about effect. Once fear had been distributed, Celestine's individuality was no longer useful. Her name had served its purpose. The memory of what happened to her would do the rest. This is how domination sustains itself over time, not through constant violence, but through strategic violence followed by silence. Celestine's story, therefore, cannot be measured only by what happened to her. It must be measured by what happened. Because of her, how behavior shifted, how voices quieted, how possibilities narrowed for others who watched and learned. And yet, there is another side to this. Fear can suppress action, but it cannot erase knowledge. Enslaved women understood exactly what the system was capable of. That understanding shaped their strategies, their alliances, and their private judgments of the world they were forced to inhabit. Celestine's punishment taught obedience, but it also taught truth. It taught that law would not protect them, that punishment could be justified endlessly, that survival required caution, not trust. Those lessons did not disappear when Celestine did. They lingered, and in that lingering, the system revealed its own dependence on intimidation. A system confident in its legitimacy does not rely so heavily on fear. It does not need to leave scars as reminders. It does not need silence to maintain order. Celestine's story shows that slavery needed all three. Why being a woman made punishment more total. Celestine was not punished simply as an enslaved person. She was punished as an enslaved woman, and that distinction shaped everything that followed. Slavery did not treat men and women the same, even when the law pretended it did. Gender determined how control was exercised, how punishment was framed, and how much suffering could be inflicted without raising concern. Enslaved women lived under a form of surveillance that extended beyond labor into morality, sexuality, and perceived attitude. Celestine's body was already regulated before she ever acted, where she could stand, how she could speak, what expression her face was allowed to hold. Women were expected to embody submission in ways that went beyond obedience. Their behavior was scrutinized for tone, posture, and deference. A man might be punished for running or striking back. A woman could be punished for appearing defiant. This meant the threshold for discipline was lower, much lower. Celestine did not need to commit a dramatic act to be seen as dangerous. She only needed to violate expectation. An expectation for enslaved women was absolute quiet compliance, physical, emotional, and psychological. This is why punishment of women often carried an additional message. It was not only about restoring order. It was about restoring femininity as defined by power. When an enslaved woman disrupted that script, punishment functioned as correction not just of behavior, but of identity. Violence was used to reassert who she was supposed to be. Celestine's punishment therefore served multiple audiences. To enslaved men, it demonstrated that women were not exempt from severe discipline. To enslaved women, it demonstrated that visibility itself was dangerous. To enslavers, it reassured that gender did not weaken authority. It expanded it. Women's bodies were seen as more manageable, more correctable, and therefore more open to extended punishment. This is why violence against enslaved women could be prolonged, repeated, and rationalized as necessary discipline rather than cruelty. And it is why records often speak about such punishment calmly. The law did not consider the gendered impact relevant. It assumed that authority over enslaved women included authority over their bodies in total laboring, reproductive, and disciplinary. Celestine existed inside that assumption. Her punishment was therefore not seen as excessive. It was seen as appropriate. This reveals something critical about how slavery sustained itself. It did not merely rely on brute force. It relied on cultural expectations about gender to legitimize that force. Women were expected to endure quietly when they did not. The system interpreted that as disorder requiring immediate correction. Celestine's experience fits into a wider pattern. Women were punished for talking back, for refusing sexual access, for leaving assigned spaces, for expressing grief too openly. Any assertion of interior life could be framed as threat. This is why the records about Celestine feel so thin. They focus on the act and the response, not the person. They do not ask how fear, exhaustion, or desperation shaped her choices. They assume that discipline itself explains everything. But that assumption collapses under scrutiny. Because if discipline were sufficient, it would not need repetition. If authority were stable, it would not need spectacle. If control were complete, it would not need explanation. Celestine's punishment exposes the opposite. It reveals a system constantly reinforcing itself, especially where women were concerned. It shows how enslaved women's lives were compressed into narrow roles, and how quickly those roles became weapons when deviation occurred. Her gender did not protect her. It intensified her vulnerability. And that vulnerability was not accidental, it was engineered. When her body became the lesson, and memory did the rest. After the punishment ended, Celestine did not need to be punished again to remain controlled. The system had achieved something more efficient than repeated violence. It turned her body into a memory. This is one of the least discussed mechanisms of slavery. Violence was not meant to be constant. It was meant to be memorable. The marks left on Celestine's body, whether visible scars, altered movement, or physical weakness, functioned as ongoing reminders. Other enslaved people did not need to hear the details of her punishment explained. They could see it. They could sense it. They could read it in how she moved differently afterward, in how her presence carried weight. This is how domination extended beyond the moment of violence. Punishment did not end when the blows stopped. It lingered in posture, in silence, in altered behavior. Celestine's body carried the lesson forward every day. She remained visible, and visibility was unavoidable. Plantation life forced proximity. People worked, slept, and moved within constrained spaces. They noticed changes. They noticed absences. They noticed pain that could not be hidden completely. Celestine became a living reminder of what happened when expectations were violated. The system relied on this. It relied on witnesses who would not intervene but would remember. Memory replaced repetition. Fear replaced enforcement. Silence replaced explanation. This is why Celestine's punishment did not need to be constantly referenced. It spoke for itself. Other enslaved women adjusted their behavior accordingly. They learned which gestures drew attention, which silences were safest, which kinds of endurance went unnoticed. Celestine's experience narrowed the margins of acceptable behavior without needing another word spoken. This is also how resistance was reshaped. Resistance did not disappear. It became quieter, more calculated, more inward. People learned to preserve themselves by avoiding visibility rather than confronting authority directly. Celestine's punishment clarified the cost of being seen, and yet, memory does not function only as fear. It also carries knowledge. Enslaved people understood, through Celestine, how far the system would go. They learned that law would not intervene, that punishment could be justified endlessly, that there were no safe appeals. This knowledge shaped not just behavior, but belief. They stopped believing in fairness where none existed. That belief mattered. It stripped away illusions. It replaced hope in the system with reliance on one another, on caution, on internal judgments about what was right, even when right could not be acted upon openly. Celestine's body became the site where this understanding crystallized. She did not need to speak for others to understand. Her continued presence communicated more than words could, and when she eventually disappeared from view, sold, transferred, or absorbed back into labor, the memory did not disappear with her. It stayed. This is why systems of domination fear memory more than momentary defiance. Memory cannot be punished easily. It travels quietly. It reshapes behavior without announcing itself. It undermines authority, not by overthrowing it, but by exposing its nature. Celestine's punishment was meant to stabilize control. It also revealed the cost of that control to everyone forced to live under it. Her body, marked and altered, became part of the plantation's unwritten curriculum, a lesson passed on without instruction, a warning delivered without speech. And once learned, it could not be unlearned. When the records stop and erasure takes over, at a certain point, Celestine disappears, not because her life ended, not because her suffering ended, but because the system stopped needing to write about her. This is one of the most brutal truths of archival history. Silence does not mean peace. It means irrelevance to power. Once Celestine's punishment had served its purpose, once order had been restored, fear distributed, and precedent established, there was no reason to continue documenting her. She returned to the condition most enslaved people lived in every day, existence without record. This disappearance is not accidental. Slavery was highly selective about what it preserved. It recorded transactions, punishments, profits, and disputes among owners. It rarely recorded recovery, survival, or interior life. Once Celestine was no longer a case, she ceased to matter to the archive. And yet, her life continued. She still woke up. She still labored. She still carried the physical and psychological consequences of what had been done to her. But none of that required documentation. This is how erasure completes violence. The punishment harmed her body. The law justified that harm. Silence ensured that harm would not trouble the future. We do not know whether Celestine was sold. Sale was a common response after punishment removal, reduced lingering reminders and prevented further disruption. We do not know whether she remained on the same plantation, living among people who remembered what had happened to her even if no one spoke of it. We do not know whether her health deteriorated, whether she was punished again, or whether she lived long enough to see emancipation. The archive offers nothing, and that absence tells us something important. If Celestine had died in a way that affected property through loss, illness, or violent resistance, it likely would have been noted. If she had escaped successfully, there might have been advertisements or notices. The lack of records suggests that she continued living in a way that did not disrupt the system again. That does not mean she accepted it. It means the system succeeded in suppressing visible resistance. This is the outcome slavery preferred, not rebellion, not death, but continued labor under silence. Celestine's disappearance from records is therefore not a mystery to be solved. It is a conclusion to the system's logic. Once discipline had been applied and normalized, there was nothing more to say. But history does not end where records end. The absence itself becomes evidence. It shows how many lives were reduced to moments of crisis and then erased. How many women existed primarily as footnotes to their own punishment. How many stories survive only because something went wrong enough to demand documentation. Celestine's life did not matter less after punishment. It mattered less to those in power. That distinction is crucial. Modern readers often search archives for voices, letters, testimonies. Celestine reminds us that silence is not proof of consent or contentment. It is proof of exclusion. Her absence from later records reflects the success of a system that punished deviation and then demanded invisibility. This is why telling her story requires restraint. We cannot invent her thoughts. We cannot assign her redemption. We cannot give her a conclusion she did not receive. What we can do is recognize what her disappearance signifies. It signifies a world where pain was temporary to observers but permanent to the person who endured it. A world where documentation served power, not memory. A world where survival often meant vanishing into routine. Celestine did not disappear because her life lacked meaning. She disappeared because the system required it, and that requirement, the demand that suffering be followed by silence, is one of slavery's most enduring violences. When history tries to fill in her life, and why that can become another 6 less. The records fall silent. Historians feel a familiar urge to fill the gap with someone like Celestine. That urge is especially strong. Her name survives. Her punishment survives. But her life after that moment dissolves into absence. And absence feels unfinished. It feels like a problem that needs solving. But here is the danger. When we rush to complete Celestine's story, we risk doing to her memory what the system did to her, life using her without listening. Many enslaved women exist in history this way, a name attached to a court case, a punishment, a transaction. Scholars try to reconstruct what might have happened next. Was she sold? Did she survive to emancipation? Did she form family ties? Did she resist again, quietly? These are human questions, but they are also speculative, and speculation, when applied carelessly to enslaved lives, can become another form of erasure. It can replace the reality of not knowing with narratives that make audiences feel better, narratives of endurance, quiet resilience, or eventual peace. Celestine's story resists that comfort. What we know for certain is limited, and that limitation is meaningful. The archive tells us exactly what the system cared about: discipline, order, justification. It tells us almost nothing about recovery, interior life, or long-term consequence. That imbalance is not a flaw in the historical record. It is the historical record. To treat absence as something to be smoothed over is to miss what it reveals. Celestine's silence is not an empty space waiting to be filled. It is evidence of a world in which enslaved women were only visible when they disrupted power. This is why careful historians approach stories like hers differently. Instead of asking, what probably happened next, they ask, why do we not know what happened next? That shift matters. It moves attention away from imagined outcomes and back toward structural reality. Celestine's disappearance teaches us how slavery organized memory. It preserved what justified control. It discarded what reflected consequence. It archived punishment, not pain. This pattern repeats across thousands of cases. Enslaved women surface briefly, often in moments of crisis, and then vanish again. Their lives did not become less real after those moments. They simply became less useful to power. There is also a moral dimension to resisting speculation. Celestine did not consent to have her life reconstructed for narrative satisfaction. She did not authorize historians, filmmakers, or educators to assign her a fate that makes audiences feel resolution. To respect her story means respecting its limits. That does not mean silence. It means precision. We can say what the system did to her. We can say how it justified that action. We can say what patterns her case fits into. What we cannot do without repeating harm is turn her into a symbol that behaves conveniently. Celestine is not a lesson with a moral payoff. She is a life shaped by domination, discipline, and disappearance. And that disappearance is not a failure of history. It is one of its most important truths. Her story reminds us that the past is not incomplete because we lack imagination. It is incomplete because injustice destroys evidence, and when we sit with that incompleteness, without rushing to resolve it, we honor Celestine more honestly than any invented ending ever could. Why her story was ordinary, and why that is the most disturbing part. Celestine is often approached as a singular figure, a woman whose punishment was so severe or so documented that it demands attention, but the deeper truth is more unsettling. What happened to her was not unusual. It was ordinary. That ordinariness is precisely what makes her story difficult to absorb. Slavery did not rely on constant spectacle. It relied on routine, on patterns repeated so often they stopped provoking comment. Celestine's punishment stands out to us not because it was extreme by the standards of her time, but because it happened to be written down. Her case fits neatly into a wider pattern. Enslaved women were punished through legal mechanisms not as a last resort, but as a means of maintenance. Courts existed not to protect them, but to stabilize the system when informal discipline was deemed insufficient, or when authority needed reinforcement. Celestine's case was processed calmly because it was familiar. There were templates for this, precedents to cite, language already prepared. The system did not need to invent a response. It simply applied what had been applied before. This is where modern audiences often struggle. We want atrocities to feel exceptional. We want to believe that suffering rises to the level of record only when something has gone terribly wrong. But under slavery, suffering was the baseline. Records did not appear because violence was rare. They appeared when violence needed explanation. Celestine was punished not because she represented chaos, but because she represented deviation. Deviation threatened predictability, and predictability was essential to profit, control, and peace among enslavers. The law stepped in when deviation risked spreading. Her story therefore exposes a critical misunderstanding about slavery. The system was not constantly breaking down. It was constantly calibrating. Punishment was a tool of adjustment, not desperation. Celestine's suffering did not signal crisis. It signaled maintenance. This reframing matters. It shifts the focus away from individual cruelty toward structural normalcy. The people involved in her punishment may have believed they were acting reasonably. They may have viewed themselves as enforcing order, not committing atrocity. That belief is what allowed the system to persist. Celestine's story also reveals why so many similar stories remain unknown. Most enslaved women punished in this way never appeared in court records. Their punishment was handled informally through overseers, owners, and household discipline. The law intervened only when something needed to be formalized. That means for every Celestine we can name, there are countless others we cannot. Her story is not important because it is unique. It is important because it is representative of how enslaved women's bodies were regulated, representative of how law functioned as reinforcement, representative of how violence was normalized through procedure. Understanding this strips away the comfort of distance. It means we cannot dismiss her experience as an anomaly or a moral failure of a few individuals. It means acknowledging that entire communities, institutions, and legal systems participated in sustaining conditions that made her punishment possible and acceptable. Celestine forces us to confront a painful reality. Injustice does not always announce itself loudly. Often it embeds itself in routine until it becomes invisible. Her story survives not because it was shocking to her contemporaries, but because it is shocking to us who are no longer accustomed to seeing violence justified so openly. That shock is a gift. It allows us to see what those inside the system were trained not to see. And once seen, it cannot be unseen. Why her name survived, and what that survival, demons of U.S. Celestine, should not have a name we can speak today. By the logic of slavery, she should have vanished, completely absorbed back into labor, silence, and anonymity. Millions did. Their lives ended without trace, their suffering undocumented, their existence flattened into numbers and property lists. And yet, Celestine's name survived. Not because she was valued, not because she was protected, but because power needed a record of what it did to her. This is the cruel irony at the heart of her remembrance. Her name exists because violence required justification, because punishment needed legitimacy, because authority wanted proof that it had acted correctly. Celestine was named not to honor her humanity, but to secure control. That survival carries responsibility. History does not give us Celestine as a gift. It gives her as a challenge. Why this woman? Why this moment? Why this documentation, when so much else was erased? The answer is not randomness. It is function. Her name remained because it served the system once, and now, centuries later, it serves a different purpose entirely. It exposes how selective memory truly is. Archives preserve what power finds useful. They forget what threatens comfort. Celestine's case survived because it fit neatly into administrative logic. Her interior life did not survive because it did not. That imbalance forces us to read carefully. We cannot treat her name as evidence of inclusion. It is evidence of extraction. Something was taken from her: obedience, suffering, silence, and what remains is a trace shaped by those who took it. To remember Celestine honestly means refusing to turn her survival in the archive into a story of recognition or progress. Her name did not survive because she was seen. It survived because she was disciplined. That distinction matters. It changes how we engage with her memory. It shifts our focus away from celebrating recovery and toward confronting why. Recovery was never the goal. Celestine's name is not a triumph of record-keeping. It is an indictment of what record-keeping prioritized. This also changes how we think about responsibility. If Celestine's name survived because violence was documented, then remembering her now is not a neutral act. It is a reversal. It takes something created to stabilize domination and repurposes it to expose that domination instead. But that reversal must be done carefully. We do not honor Celestine by embellishing her story. We do not honor her by assigning her imagined peace. We do not honor her by resolving what history left unresolved. We honor her by holding the discomfort steady, by recognizing that her name stands in for countless others whose names were never written down. By understanding that her story survived not because she was spared, but because she was used, and by refusing to let that use define the final meaning of her life. Celestine's name is a fragment. It is not a biography. It is not a redemption arc. It is not closure. It is an opening into the mechanics of punishment. An opening into the priorities of law. An opening into how easily human beings can be reduced to examples. What we owe Celestine is not admiration. What we owe her is precision, a refusal to soften what her survival reveals about power, memory, and erasure. Her name survived because the system needed it to. Now it survives because we refuse to forget what that system did. When legality, repellage justice, and no one was mean to notice, Celestine exposes one of the most dangerous illusions in any society. The belief that legality equals justice. Her case shows, with chilling clarity, how the law can function smoothly while morality collapses completely. Everything done to Celestine followed rules. That is what makes her story so difficult to confront. The punishment was authorized. The procedures were observed. The records were filed. From the perspective of the court, the matter was resolved. There was no miscarriage of justice because justice, as defined by the system, had been served. The law had done exactly what it was designed to do. But that design never included Celestine. Justice, in any meaningful sense, requires recognition of harm, accountability for those who cause it, and repair for those who endure it. Celestine received none of these. The law did not ask whether she had been harmed. It did not question the authority that ordered her punishment. It did not provide any mechanism for repair. Instead, it focused on order. Order was easier to measure than suffering. Order could be documented, cited, and defended. Celestine's pain could not, and so the system treated her pain as irrelevant. This is where legality becomes dangerous. When law defines people as property, it transforms violence into administration. It allows harm to be framed as maintenance. It creates a world where someone can be punished severely and still be considered treated fairly because procedures were followed. Celestine's case shows how this logic works in practice. The court did not see a woman. It saw a disruption. It saw a risk to stability. It saw something that needed to be corrected. Once corrected, the system moved on. There was no appeal for Celestine, no recognition of disproportion, no space to question whether punishment itself caused more harm than whatever act preceded it. The law was satisfied because authority was reaffirmed. This divergence between legality and morality is not unique to slavery, but slavery makes it unmistakable. Celestine's story reminds us that laws can be precise, consistent, and efficient and still be fundamentally unjust. It reminds us that systems often confuse their own stability with righteousness, and it reminds us that suffering can be rendered invisible simply by redefining it as necessary. What makes her case especially powerful is its ordinariness. There was no scandal, no public outcry, no reform sparked by what happened to her. The law absorbed her punishment without disruption. That absorption is itself evidence of how normalized such violence was. Celestine did not fail the law. The law failed her by design. Understanding this changes how we think about accountability. There was no individual villain in her case who could be removed to fix the problem. The cruelty did not hinge on one sadistic actor. It was distributed across institutions, procedures, and assumptions. Responsibility was everywhere, and therefore nowhere. This diffusion of responsibility is what allowed the system to endure. When everyone is following rules, no one feels guilty. When violence is procedural, no one feels personally accountable. When harm is lawful, it stops being questioned. Celestine's suffering was the cost of that convenience. Her story forces us to confront the uncomfortable truth that justice cannot be measured solely by whether laws are obeyed. It must be measured by whose humanity those laws recognize and whose they erase. Celestine was erased not because the law malfunctioned. She was erased because the law functioned perfectly. When a can case honorability comes too late and repair is no longer possible, Celestine confronts us with a version of injustice that modern societies struggle to acknowledge. Harm that cannot be repaired, no matter how clearly it is later understood. There is a temptation, when looking back at cases like hers, to ask what justice would look like now. Apologies, memorials, scholarly recognition, public acknowledgement. These gestures matter, but they also reveal a limit that cannot be crossed. None of them reach Celestine. Accountability that arrives generations later does not interrupt suffering. It does not alter outcomes. It does not return autonomy, health, or time. Celestine lived and endured inside a system that offered no mechanism for repair. And when that system finally ended, it did so without accounting for what it had consumed. This is not a failure of memory. It is a structural reality. Celestine's case shows us that some injustices are complete before they are recognized as such. By the time language exists to describe the harm, the person who bore it is already gone, often without trace, without restitution, without even certainty about what became of them. That reality is uncomfortable because it resists moral closure. We want injustice to be followed by correction. We want recognition to lead to repair. We want history to bend toward resolution. Celestine offers none of this. Her story demands a different kind of accountability, one that does not pretend to fix the past, but instead interrogates the systems that made repair impossible in the first place. This shifts the focus away from individual blame. The question is not who failed Celestine personally. It is how many layers of authority collaborated to make her failure inevitable. Owners, courts, laws, customs, and silence all played roles. No single reform could have saved her. No isolated moral awakening could have altered her outcome. The harm was systemic and therefore irreparable within the system that produced it. That realization forces us to rethink what we mean by justice. Justice is not only about punishment after the fact, it is about preventing harm before it becomes permanent. Celestine's story shows what happens when prevention is never considered, when suffering is treated as acceptable cost, and when accountability is defined narrowly enough to exclude those most affected. It also challenges how we use historical acknowledgement. Recognition without responsibility risks becoming symbolic rather than substantive. Naming Celestine matters, but naming alone is not justice. It is a beginning, not an end. And it places responsibility not on our past, but on our present. What do we do with stories that cannot be redeemed? We can refuse to turn them into inspiration. We can refuse to soften them with imagined outcomes. We can refuse to treat acknowledgement as absolution. Instead, we can allow them to unsettle how we think about power, law, and repair today. Celestine's story reminds us that some harms do not end cleanly. They fade into absence, silence, and unmarked continuation. Justice, when it comes too late, must therefore change its purpose, from fixing what cannot be fixed to preventing repetition. Her life cannot be repaired, but the conditions that made her erasure possible can be examined, challenged, and dismantled if her story is allowed to remain unresolved. That unresolved quality is not a weakness. It is a warning why her story revises comfort and why that reversal is Etheric Celestine's story does something many historical narratives do not. It offers no release. There is no escape scene, no courtroom reversal, no late life testimony that reframes suffering as triumph. And that absence is not a flaw in the story. It is the story. Modern audiences are trained to expect resolution, even when history is brutal. We look for an ending that restores balance, survival, recognition, reform, or at least clear condemnation. Celestine gives us none of these. Her life enters the record through punishment and exits through silence. The harm stands. The system moves on. That discomfort is not incidental. It is ethical. Stories like Celestine's force us to confront a reality we often avoid. Many lives were broken without consequence, and history does not always provide tools to fix that. There is no narrative mechanism that can make her suffering worth it. No moral algebra that transforms pain into progress. This is precisely why her story matters. Comforting narratives allow audiences to feel morally aligned without being challenged. They suggest that injustice, once recognized, naturally leads to correction. Celestine contradicts that idea. She shows us a world where recognition came too late or not at all, and where the machinery of power absorbed harm without resistance. Sitting with that reality requires restraint. It means resisting the urge to turn Celestine into a symbol that reassures us about our own moral position. That means not using her suffering to demonstrate how far we have come, or to imply that history inevitably improves. Her story does not exist to validate progress. It exists to expose cost paid by individuals whose lives were deemed expendable in the maintenance of order, cost that was normalized, justified, and then forgotten, cost that cannot be retroactively redeemed. Discomfort in this context is not something to overcome. It is something to maintain. It keeps us from rushing past the implications of what happened. It prevents us from resolving Celestine's life into a lesson that flatters the present. It insists that we acknowledge how easily systems can absorb suffering while remaining legally intact. This is why her story still feels heavy. It does not allow distance. It does not offer emotional closure. It does not tell us what to feel at the end. Instead, it asks us to remain attentive, to recognize that some histories demand witness rather than interpretation, presence rather than explanation. Celestine's refusal of comfort is a form of resistance that survives her erasure. It resists being used as inspiration. It resists being softened by time. It resists being resolved into something neat. That resistance matters because it mirrors the ethical stance we must take toward histories of domination. Not mastery, not consumption, but humility. Her story teaches us that remembering is not about satisfaction. It is about responsibility, and responsibility sometimes means accepting that there is nothing we can do to make the past right only. Something we can do to prevent ourselves from becoming comfortable with how wrong it was, remembering without resolution, and why that may be the most honest ending. Celestine does not give us an ending in the way stories usually do. There is no final image to hold on to, no reunion, no vindication, no moment that restores balance. What remains is a record that begins with punishment and fades into absence, and that is exactly where her story must end. Not because it is incomplete, but because incompleteness is the truth. History often tempts us to believe that understanding leads to closure, that if we study long enough, name enough facts, and speak the right words, the past will settle into something finished. Celestine refuses that promise. She reminds us that some lives were interrupted so thoroughly that history itself cannot finish the sentence. To remember her honestly is to resist the urge to conclude. It means accepting that her suffering did not serve a higher purpose, that it did not lead directly to reform, that it did not correct the system that harmed her. The machinery of slavery continued. The law continued. The archive continued. Celestine did not. This kind of ending challenges how we think about memory. Memory is often framed as healing, as a way to mend what was broken by bringing it into the light. But Celestine's story suggests another function of memory: to hold open what cannot be healed. Her name survives not to make peace with the past, but to prevent us from simplifying it. She stands as a reminder that domination often succeeds quietly, that violence can be fully legal, and that entire lives can be reduced to a single, documented moment before disappearing again. She shows us that justice delayed is not justice denied. It is justice never intended. Ending her story without resolution is not an act of neglect. It is an act of refusal. a refusal to invent meaning where none was granted, a refusal to transform endurance into virtue, a refusal to make her life carry a lesson that excuses the system that consumed it. Celestine does not need to be redeemed by history. History needs to be unsettled by her. Her story reshapes how we approach the past, not as a collection of completed arcs, but as a field of unresolved harms that still demand ethical attention. It teaches us that remembrance is not about feeling better informed or morally superior. It is about staying accountable to what cannot be fixed. So we end where the records end, with her name, with what was done, with what cannot be undone, and with the understanding that some stories do not close. They remain open, asking us not for answers, but for vigilance. Celestine's life does not resolve. It endures, not as comfort, not as inspiration, but as a truth we are not meant to outgrow. What Celestine leaves behind, even when nothing was left from her. Celestine leaves no legacy in the way history usually defines it. No descendants who testified, no autobiography, no movement bearing her name. And yet, she leaves behind something harder, heavier, and more unsettling, a structural truth. Her story forces us to confront the reality that most enslaved lives did not end in freedom, recognition, or transformation. They ended in continuation, in more labor, in more silence, in more time stolen without record. Celestine's significance is not found in what followed her life. It is found in what did not follow. There was no reckoning, no reversal, no interruption of the system that harmed her. Slavery did not pause to absorb what it had done. It simply adjusted and continued. That continuation is the legacy Celestine exposes. This matters because historical memory often privileges outcomes. We remember figures whose lives connect to visible change. We build narratives around people whose suffering can be linked to progress. Celestine resists that framework entirely. Her story tells us that most suffering did not lead to reform. Most violence did not provoke moral crisis. Most injustice did not collapse under its own weight. Instead, it normalized itself. Celestine's life shows us how domination persists, not through constant spectacle, but through endurance, through the ability to harm without consequence and then move on as if nothing significant occurred. That is the inheritance she leaves us. Not hope, not despair, but clarity. Clarity about how systems survive by absorbing human cost. Clarity about how legality can coexist with cruelty. Clarity about how silence is not absence but outcome. Her story also challenges how we assign meaning. If meaning only exists where there is redemption, then Celestine's life would be meaningless. That conclusion would repeat the violence done to her, reducing her worth to usefulness. Instead, her life demands a different metric. Her life mattered because it was lived under conditions that denied its value. Her suffering mattered because it was imposed, not because it produced something afterward. Her name matters because it reminds us that countless others were never named at all. Celestine leaves behind a responsibility rather than a resolution, a responsibility to resist narratives that require progress to justify pain, a responsibility to recognize that injustice does not need to be exceptional to be devastating, a responsibility to remember that most victims of systems like slavery were not symbols. They were people whose lives ended without acknowledgement. In that sense, Celestine's story does not ask us to feel inspired. It asks us to remain honest. Honest about how much history does not resolve. Honest about how many lives were consumed without remainder. Honest about how easily systems train societies to accept that consumption as normal. Drop 16 does not move us forward in time. It deepens what we already know. And it prepares us for the final, hardest question this story leaves behind. Not about Celestine herself, but about us, inheriting a history that cannot be repaired. What does it mean to inherit a history like Celestine's? Not to study it, not to summarize it, but to carry it forward, knowing that nothing we do can make it right. Celestine did not leave instructions for us. She did not ask to be remembered in a particular way. She did not imagine an audience centuries later parsing her disappearance. The inheritance we receive is therefore not permission, it is obligation. And that obligation is uncomfortable. We inherit histories like hers without the ability to compensate the harmed, to restore what was taken, or to balance the scales. There is no ethical transaction that settles the debt, no gesture that concludes the matter. The harm is complete, and it remains complete, no matter how well we understand it. This is where remembrance becomes responsibility rather than relief. Responsibility does not ask us to feel resolved. It asks us to stay attentive, to resist forgetting when forgetting would be easier. Celestine's story challenges a common impulse, to turn historical knowledge into moral reassurance. We often tell ourselves that knowing the past, naming its injustices, condemning them clearly means we have done our part. But knowledge without vigilance can become another form of distance. Celestine does not allow distance. Her life reminds us that systems of domination rarely announce themselves as monstrous. They present themselves as orderly, lawful, and necessary. They ask ordinary people to participate in small ways, to accept routine harm, to trust procedures over conscience. Those systems do not disappear with time. They evolve. Inheriting Celestine's history, therefore, means asking difficult questions of the present. Where does legality still outrun justice? Where does procedure still mask harm? Where does silence still function as an outcome rather than an absence? These questions are not abstract. They are the ethical afterlife of her story. To inherit this history honestly is to accept that remembrance is not an endpoint. It is a practice, one that requires patience, restraint, and the willingness to sit with unresolved harm without converting it into narrative comfort. Celestine does not ask us to speak for her. She asks us not to speak past her, to keep the gap open where the records end, to refuse endings that tidy what was never repaired, to recognize that some histories demand ongoing attention rather than closure. This kind of inheritance is heavy, but it is also precise. It does not flatter the present. It does not absolve the past. It does not promise improvement without effort. It simply insists that we remain accountable to truths that cannot be made easier with time. Celestine's story does not live on because it teaches a lesson. It lives on because it refuses one. If you want to continue into the final reflection, say drop 18. Next section will bring the documentary to a close by examining what it means to end without resolution. Why some stories must remain unfinished, and how ethical remembrance resists forgetting without claiming mastery, ending without closure, and why this is where must stop. Celestine does not give us permission to finish her story. That is the final truth this documentary must accept. There is a powerful instinct, especially in long-form history, to end well, to draw a line, to summarize meaning, to offer a final moral that allows the audience to exhale and move on. Celestine's life resists that instinct completely, because nothing about what happened to her was resolved. The harm was not corrected. The system was not interrupted. The record was not completed, and history did not circle back to make it right. To end this story cleanly would be to repeat the logic that erased her in the first place. The logic that says lives only matter when they produce outcomes, when they conclude neatly, when they can be packaged into meaning. Celestine's life was not a narrative. It was an existence constrained, disciplined, and then made invisible. So the most honest ending is not a conclusion, but a pause, a refusal to turn her suffering into a lesson that benefits us more than it respects her. A refusal to claim mastery over a life that history itself refused to preserve. A refusal to confuse understanding with resolution. What we are left with is not emptiness. We are left with responsibility. Responsibility to recognize how easily law can replace justice. Responsibility to notice how violence becomes routine when it is procedural. Responsibility to see how silence is often the final stage of domination, not its absence. Celestine does not ask us to carry her story forward as inspiration. She asks us to carry forward its weight, to remember that most people crushed by systems like slavery did not leave behind voices, victories, or visible legacies. They left behind gaps, interruptions, lives that ended without recognition. Those gaps are not failures of history. They are evidence. Evidence of what power chose to preserve and what it was willing to destroy without record. Evidence of how normal cruelty can become when it is lawful. Evidence of how many lives were deemed unworthy of completion. So we stop here, not because there is nothing more to say, but because saying more would risk speaking over her rather than with what remains. Celestine's story does not close. It stays open, as a reminder that some truths are not meant to comfort, as a warning that justice delayed is often justice denied by design, as a demand that remembrance remain ethical, restrained, and unresolved. This is not an ending. It is an insistence. And that insistence is where her story still lives, when excellence becomes the final witness. After everything that can be said has been said, silence remains. Not the silence of forgetting, but the silence that follows understanding. Celestine reaches us across time, not through words, but through what is missing. Her silence is not empty. It is heavy. It carries the weight of everything the system refused to hear while she was alive. This is the final role silence plays in stories like hers. First, silence is enforced. Then, silence is normalized. Finally, silence becomes evidence. Celestine was silenced as a person long before she vanished from the archive. Her voice was never requested. Her explanation never sought. Her pain never interrogated. By the time the record stopped mentioning her, silence is no longer imposed. It is assumed. And that assumption tells us everything. It tells us that her interior life was never considered relevant, that the system did not require her consent, her understanding, or her survival in order to function. Silence was not a failure of communication. It was a condition of control. But centuries later, that same silence functions differently. It speaks. It tells us how domination completes itself, not with noise, but with quiet, not with chaos, but with routine, not with endless violence, but with the confidence that violence no longer needs to be explained. Celestine's silence now stands where testimony might have been, and we must resist the urge to fill it. Not every silence needs interpretation. Some silences demand respect. They remind us that history is not ours to complete, only ours to confront, to sit with what cannot be retrieved. To acknowledge that some lives were not meant to be legible to us. Celestine's silence is not an invitation to imagine her thoughts. It is a demand that we recognize why she was never allowed to speak. In that recognition, the final witness emerges. Not a person, not a document, but an absence that refuses to be ignored. An absence that exposes the cost of systems built on order at the expense of humanity. Silence does not absolve the past. It indicts it. And as long as we are willing to listen to what silence reveals, rather than rushing to overcome it, Celestine has not vanished entirely. She remains, not as a story completed, not as a lesson resolved, but as a truth that endures precisely because it was never allowed to speak. What it means to walk away carrying this story. At some point, every documentary ends. The voice stops, the audience moves on. But Celestine's story is not meant to move on with you. It is meant to stay, not as a memory you revisit, but as a weight that subtly alters how you see power, law, and silence in the world around you. This is the final responsibility her story leaves behind. Not action in her name, not redemption through knowledge, not comfort through condemnation, but attentiveness. Attentiveness to how easily suffering can be made ordinary. Attentiveness to how often legality still replaces justice. Attentiveness to how many lives remain undocumented until something goes wrong. Celestine teaches us that history is not only shaped by dramatic resistance or famous names, it is shaped by quiet endurance, by punishment that worked exactly as intended, by systems that did not collapse under cruelty but were strengthened by it. Her story reminds us that most injustice succeeds, not because it is hidden, but because it is normalized. When you walk away from this story, nothing asks you to feel resolved. There is no final judgment to deliver, no moral balance restored. That absence is deliberate. It mirrors the world Celestine lived in, a world that did not pause to account for what it took from her. And yet something changes simply by knowing, not because knowledge fixes the past, but because it sharpens the present. You begin to notice how institutions speak in neutral language while causing harm, how procedures are praised for efficiency while people disappear within them, how silence is often mistaken for peace. Celestine's life trains us to see these patterns without needing them to announce themselves as evil. That is the quiet power of her story. It does not inspire. It does not uplift. It does not conclude. It insists. It insists that we stop expecting history to heal itself. It insists that we recognize how many lives were spent maintaining order. It insists that remembrance is not about finishing stories, but about refusing to forget what was never repaired. So this is where we end, not with answers, not with closure, but with awareness. Celestine does not ask to be remembered loudly. She asked to be remembered accurately, as a woman whose life was constrained, punished, documented, and then erased, and whose story survives not to comfort us, but to ensure we never confuse silence with justice again. This is not the end of her story. It is the moment it becomes yours to carry.